Welcome everybody, welcome to the forum and to our event. I'm Ravina Aggarwal, I'm the director of the Columbia Global Centers, Mumbai. So we have a series that we are organizing at the center. It's called Writing Indian Stories, and this series actually enables us to investigate the process and form of writing outside traditional academic texts, and this is the 5th episode of that series. This event commemorates the deep commitment, sacrifice and spirit of care demonstrated by nursing and the larger healthcare community, especially over the last years of the pandemic. This has come to be so invaluable, and nurses have brought their crucial and unique place in society to the forefront of our collective consciousness. So I think this event is very meaningful to us because we have deep engagements with Columbia School of Nursing. So in 2022, as per the Indian Nursing Council records, there were about 3.3 million registered nursing personnel in India. Although this was an increase since the last decade, this presents a ratio of 1.96 nurses per 1,000 population, according to the Government of India's Union Health Ministry. And this is much less than the WHO norm of 3 nurses, right, per 1,000. So according to experts, India is in need of 4.3 million more nurses by 2024. But despite the national shortfall, India remains one of the top sources of healthcare professionals across the world. That nursing remains a popular option for Indian women reflects the profession's rich legacy in the country, offering a path towards social mobility, respect, and independence. Often, in the face of limited or restrictive alternatives, journeys such as the one that Jyoti Thottam, our author, poignantly captures in Sisters of Mokama, the pioneering women who brought hope and healing to India, which was published by Penguin Random House earlier this year. This historical narrative, which begins in Kentucky in the US at the end of World War II, tells the unique story of the establishment of the Nazareth Hospital and Nursing Training Center in Mokama in Bihar in newly independent India.
Honestly, the way that I think of it, and the thing that sort of really captured me about the story is, on some level, it's simply an adventure story. It's the amazing true story of 6 women from Kentucky who left their homes. They got on a ship, were told to say goodbye to their families forever, they thought. They got on a ship and landed in India just a few months after partition. They knew what they were there for. They were meant to start a missionary hospital in Bihar, which they didn't really know this. They knew the place was in need, but they didn't really know the situation in Bihar at that time. So they had no idea what they were getting into. They had a sort of empty hospital, basically a warehouse, no running water, no electricity, no doctors, no nurses, except the 6 of them had some training, and they were meant to start a hospital. So the book follows the story of how they did that, but of course they did not do this alone. So the story is also about the Indian women who became really their essential partners in this work. And one of those women is my mother. She studied nursing with them. In some ways, it's a way of really understanding, well, what is that story? Like, what really happened and what did it mean? Because I think that migration story is often much more complicated than we might think. Similarly, it's a way of rethinking the story of nurses, or who are nurses. I mean, my mother was a nurse. I mean, she's still here, but she's retired now. Many of the people that I grew up with as family friends are also nurses, and the women that I knew did not fit the picture, the sort of stereotypical picture of nurses as these sort of, selfless, caring angels. I mean, they're she's my mother, of course she is on some level, but I also knew that these were incredibly tough, independent-minded women who had been taking care of themselves. In my mother's case, since she was 15 years old, she left home to study nursing. So I thought, what is that story really? Who are they as women, as people, not just this image of nursing? And then similarly, it was for me I'm not an academic, but as a student and avid reader of history, it was also a way for me to, tell this sort of small slice of Indian history. I think what we know of partition in some ways is so limited. So I hope the story also kind of complicates that. It was a huge learning process for me. I mean, again, like I've been a journalist for a very long time. So I started with what I was comfortable with, which was interviewing people. I mean, that's the typical mode of information gathering for journalists. You find the people who know about the thing you're interested in, and you just talk to them for as long as they can tolerate you, really. So that's where I started. I talked to not just my mother, but people that I knew who were connected to the hospital. I did manage to interview the youngest of the original nuns when she was in her 80s. She's since passed away. And so I had a sense of the story, but then once I got from the convent they sent me a few of the letters that the sisters had sent home from the ship, going to India, and they were just so rich and so detailed, and I wanted more and more. And they told me it's really a wonderful institution in Kentucky. They have 2 full-time archivists, which was amazing to me. They're very proud of their history. They told me they had this huge archive and records, like day-by-day records of everything that had happened and letters. But they said, but we've never made that available to anyone outside the order. That's our, like the institutional history, like we don't make that available, except they had done a little bit for people researching family history, genealogy. But so of course then I thought, well, I have to have that. So I spent months and months, sort of gently prodding them, like, could I please, and they would very politely decline, put me off. And finally I just flew to Kentucky to try to make my case in person to the president of the order. And she finally agreed. And when she did, she said to me, I realized that this story that you're trying to tell is significant, not just for Catholic history or for the order, but really for women's history. And she said, if we don't make this available, everything that these women did would just be lost to history. So I really felt a great responsibility at that point to try to do justice to that story.
So they all come to Mokama from different parts, and they converge in Mokama, which then becomes almost like a safe space it's a very violent place, right? There's a lot of insecurity. There's food insecurity, there's gang violence, there's a lot going on. And yet it becomes almost a safe space, if you can say, for these women to express their desire for the world, right? And to be part of the world.
I know, I think this is one of the things it's sort of hard to understand if you've never been inside a convent, and over the course of the years, or at least in this convent, over the course of the years researching this book, I've actually, every time I visited, I've stayed in the convent. Like, they have little guest rooms right there with them. There's nowhere else really to stay in Mokama. And, their life there, it is definitely constrained by, the order of going to church every day, and they have a very set schedule. But also remember that in an extremely patriarchal society, this is an entire institution, a hospital run by women, and now it's run by Indian women. They set the terms of everything that they do. And the young women who come there, they know that in that attempt to sort of educate themselves, find a profession, go out into the world on their own, in that process, what this institution does is it allows them to be independent without being alone. Like, they have this community around them. And for many of them, because they do come from such conservative, in the sense of traditional families, that structure of a school that's sort of protected by women, it's sort of safe from the outside world, that's an acceptable way to leave home. And they lived there for years. They're trained as nurses. There's housing available to them. They have a certain status in the community and status when they come back home. So it created, in this way, a sort of acceptable means for women to essentially break out of the norms of sort of immediately marrying and staying at home, close to home.
all these issues that have been ongoing. They weren't new, but they got ripped apart in a new way, in the same way that these sisters getting off a boat and arriving in Bihar were in a world of great change. And what they ended up doing, and I think a lot of it was very conscious, was they built a hospital and a nursing school that has all the structures, the essence of what a healthy global and country healthcare system should be. They, first of all, it was nurses. Nurses were the backbone of the healthcare system. No surprise that it's not known, because we live under a medical hierarchy everywhere. We're fighting to do this and to change it, because we bring skills and prevention and ties to the community that no one else does. They had to go to the community. They had to open it. They had to understand the health problems of the community, and they did this in such incredible ways. I mean, they really took on potential racism. I mean, these white women from Kentucky did not blend in, and they did not pretend to have the answers. They were there to work, and they got the answers from the community. Sister Crescentia Weiss, right? She builds an amazing Hansen's disease clinic, which we know as leprosy, broke through stigma, got the medicines, right? And made this, and was able to convince the community that they could get treated for a disease that had made them pariahs forever, right? They got the community supported every time. They never gave up. So they had that piece of it. They had the piece of inequity, they had the piece of the community, and they were nurses really taking on, they understood interprofessional relationships. I find the story of Dr. Wiss incredible in many levels, and she eventually leaving the order and going on to live another piece of her life, right? So it is, all the things that they contained are what we need in robust healthcare system now as much as ever, or more than ever. So I see you're documenting this and making them alive as an incredible contribution to global health equity. To me, oral histories represent their lived experiences, and they've been considered kind of an outlier to research. So the whole movement to make them as valid parts of research has been a big struggle, and the Center for Oral History and Research at Columbia University has done an excellent job on making this as a form that you learn from and that should direct policy.
I mean, the letters and the archives were indispensable to me, but even as much as I had, that there are always going to be people who are missing from the written record, and I felt a real commitment and a responsibility to try to acknowledge that and to address that some way in my book. I actually relied on an oral history project that I think the University of Kentucky had done, interviewing women who had worked in the frontier nursing service in Kentucky. And so although I was never able to meet Dr. Wiss in person, when I'm describing her personality, what I'm actually quoting from is her own oral history of her talking about herself.
What we ended up doing with the stories from Liberia and Sierra Leone is we created a website, and it's their live transcripts, they're speaking, and their pictures come up and they tell their stories, because everyone should know, and every one of us has a story, many stories, right? And in this case, it's the story of working on the front lines and how people survive and the toll they pay.